Welcome to the How Good Science Can Make a Movie Better panel. I'm Renata Fiora. I'm here because I'm a physics teacher and I'm always on board for good science. Let's see. Have my fellow panelists introduce themselves?
Yes, I'll start. My name is Sean Sullivan. I am by both education and career a mechanical engineer. I specialize in polymer rheology, failure theory. I like how plastics break.
That's great. I'm Jennifer Willett. I am a science writer, primarily about physics and related topics, so yay. I also spent 2 years running a program for the National Academy of Sciences called the Science and Entertainment Exchange, which strives to match scientists with writers and directors and producers in Hollywood in the hope that they would form relationships and maybe get better, more accurate depiction of science and scientists in the films. I have many thoughts on this, and you will hear about them because you are a captive audience.
My favorite kind as a teacher.
I am Emily Fink. By training, I'm a forensic anthropologist, but by preference and talent, I'm a science communicator. I prefer living people to dead people.
And I prefer dead people to me. No.
There's a lot to be said for dead people.
Dr. Rachel Burks. I'm a chemist. I specialize in forensic science, designing systems to find a lot of times dead stuff, to be honest with you. I worked in a crime lab for a couple of years and write for Skeptic. And this season I'm on the Science Channel show Outrageous Acts of Science. Yay!
Excellent. Well, we've had a few discussions, a little bit up here about where to start, but I was just thinking, given that our description is totally written in question format, how about we answer each question kind of as a panelist, and then we'll open it up to other ideas and to audience questions as well. So, at what point is suspension of disbelief not a good enough reason to mess up the science?
I think it has to do with how the movie is presented. Specifically, I'm not going to particularly say any spoilers, but my favorite movie as an example of this is Interstellar. We'll leave it at that. I don't know if we're going to get into spoilers or not, but...
I'm totally talking about Interstellar. Spoilers meet the end.
Spoilers meet the end? All right. So, the premise lays out the movie. The movie is laid out in such a way where it's like they're trying to hold as much true to the actual science as physically possible. And then in like the last half hour, it's just like, here's fifth dimensional love and what? I mean, I came to this movie expecting like realistic depictions of black holes, relativity theory, and then I get this. And it just completely killed any respect I had for the movie at that point.
Yeah, in an earlier panel we were discussing the difference between science fiction as a film and genre type and science fantasy, and which one worked better for us personally. And then we kind of came up with the idea that science fiction was they're going to try to say that the science is real and try to hold it real, and that's where the suspension of disbelief just becomes ridiculous because they don't ever get it right. Whereas science fantasy is more of the, we're not even going to pretend. It's just science is our magic wand to make the cool things happen. So, comic book movies and Doctor Who and that kind of stuff.
I think for me, I think for me it would be what derails them is the suspension of disbelief. It is tied to me to the characters, and it's kind of like almost a Clark Kent. I'll buy into this wacky thing that you've just said. It's a red substance, and it's like, okay, it's going to cause like all kinds of hoo-ha. I'm going to buy into it. You don't have to explain it. But if it doesn't, if this thing that's occurring does not fit in with the characters you've built, you're asking them to do something that doesn't make sense to the characters you've built, then I can't then buy into this, to the thing. And what I know from my own bias is, it's the scientific process. There were many problems with Prometheus. I think we can all agree. But what I had the biggest problem with is how the field research, and I use that term very liberally, how it was done, the actual method. I mean, I'll buy the alien thing. I'll buy that there's this robot guy. And he's, I'll go with that. But there was like this moment, there's always that last straw that you're like, you had me, and I can't go that extra step. Because it almost seemed as if it's just a step too far. But it's usually, something kind of mundane. Not outrageous. It's more of the little things that you're like, really? That's the thing that you got? Yeah.
And similar to Ray, I can accept a lot if it is necessary to the plot or if it has been established as in-universe. However, someone brought up the movie The Core yesterday. I apologize.
I had a
I'm
science
sorry.
advisor, just so you know. They just didn't listen to the science advisor.
And I can accept a lot about The Core. The thing that entirely broke my suspension of disbelief for it was they're going to the core of the planet. They then go through a cave full of giant amethysts where you're entirely supposed to be in an area made out of heavy elements. Amethysts are light. Why did they call them amethysts? Look, we have giant purple crystals that we don't know what they are yet. It would have taken 30 seconds more. Amethysts. And I actually rage quit the hotel room at that point and have never seen the end of The Core.
It's interesting. I've given this a lot of thought, and I noticed that everybody picked their own worst example in movies, and it reflected their particular area of expertise. So to me, basically, what pulls you out of the story is going to be different for different people, and the greater your expertise, the more that part is going to bug you. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to spoil the movie for you. I think that sometimes we get a little too caught up in nitpicking some of the details. We're so focused on criticizing what it got wrong that we don't celebrate what the little things that they might have gotten right, like in Iron Man, the original, he actually used the solder correctly. Okay, 2 points. When I was, I'm a big fan of the TV series Manhattan by WG in America. I'm going to be on a panel discussing that, I think, on Saturday. And one of the things I loved about it was they tried to be true to the science and the history up to a point, but they deliberately used fictional characters and situations, and as they put it, emotionalized it, because they knew that in order to make that their primary goal was to make good entertainment. And I interviewed the showrunner about that, and he had a fantastic quote. He spent some time as a writer on Masters of Sex, which is also something that has a lot of human relationships and tries to work science, in scientific research into the plot. And they had a rule on that writing team: there can never be sex just for the sake of sex. It has to serve the story and the characters. And that is the rule that they applied when they were writing Manhattan. They tried as much as they could to bring in real science, but if it didn't fit the story, if it didn't serve the characters, if it didn't fit the overall storytelling arc they were trying to build, out it went. And I think that is one very important principle that we tend to lose sight of because we get so caught up in nitpicking little details. It's about the story and the characters, as Ray pointed out. She's going to get really bugged by a forensic scientist being depicted poorly. I'm going to get really bugged if they don't understand how physics works. You're going to get really bugged at the engineering or the black hole stuff. And I can say more about Interstellar, but I won't because that's not really relevant to this particular thing. Except to say that it falls into line. I mean, Kip Thorne, when he first envisioned this, was working with Steven Spielberg, who really wanted to do a scientifically accurate film. And then it got passed off to Christopher Nolan because Spielberg had a falling out with Paramount. And let's just say that Nolan cared less about the science, and that's why you have a fifth dimension being love. But there were a couple of really beautiful things that came out of that, including legitimate scientific papers that Thorne ended up writing because of the equations that he gave the visual effects renderers. So these collaborations can actually have good things come out of them. So I think that's my final message, is that, you know, by all means, it's a lot of fun to sit there and complain about the mistakes in our films, but remember that ultimately it's going to be different for each one of us. And just because you didn't like it doesn't mean it spoiled it for everyone.
Right, and there was a phrase, again, that came up earlier today that I think summarizes your point, and that's good writing, a good story will trump bad science.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of my favorite TV shows is Fringe, which has some of the worst science ever. But it's so good in depicting how I feel about science. Like, yes, I want to learn all about that giant telepathic slime mold because that can totally be cured by science. No, it can't. But I want to watch these characters go through experimenting to figure out what they can and can't do. Like, it's great writing. It's horrible, horrible science.
I feel the same way about Eureka. I
Yeah.
absolutely love the
Yes.
show. It's hysterically funny, it's moving, it's all these things, and you love the characters. And I think it does a very good job of having like scientists of all stripes, all trying to work together, you know, and different types. You get men, women, blacks, whites, Asians, everybody. They all have different specialties. But come on, I mean, a lot of the science gets pretty ridiculous, by any standard.
I think one of my, especially as a chemist, you know, chemists often lament about the one show that's on television, or was on television about us, is about a meth cook.
But it's awesome.
But it was awesome. No,
Say my name.
I am the one that nods. No, but for all of the, you know, blatant, I mean, anyone who has Google can know that meth is blue. But what I love about that is how Donna Nelson, the science advisor, got involved, of kind of reaching out and saying, you know, you're gonna have this show, you're gonna have this character, you know, little things like the drawings on the back, because there was a show, it was an American remake with Rufus Sewell, and I think in the UK Patrick Stewart was on it. I cannot remember the name, but they actually showed what we called, yes,
Oh God, yes.
they showed what we call Texas carbon. Carbon can usually, it only has 4 bonds, and they can be a mix of triple, double, single. But in the American version, they showed what we call Texas carbon, which is it had a 5th bond. And little things like that, I know I noticed it because I'm primed to look at those things. But when you look at a show like Breaking Bad, even though some of the minutia, you're like, but the way it was handled, and how much they listened to the science advisor. But to a point, even CSI had lots of science advisors. To a point, you know, they need to move the story along. And so, yeah, they're not going to take 6 months of a DNA backlog conservatively because Grissom's got things to do.
And the viewers are not waiting around for
They're
that.
not waiting around. So, you know, at some point you're like, okay, I can go with that. But then when they show ground penetrating radar actually showing like a full color image of a corpse, I'm like, is that too far, CSI? Is that too far? So it's kind of really a mixed bag. But I think with Breaking Bad, even though you're like, the writing and the characters, you're like, I'm here for it. You know, and what kind of crazy thing you're going to do next, Walter? But, you know, it kind of made up for it.
Yeah, but sometimes they get it exactly right, and it's just this beautiful, powerful thing. And there are these little moments. My husband consulted with the Bones people twice because they had physics-centric things. And the first time, the episode was half written, and all we could really do was save them from themselves, from making more mistakes. You know, but they didn't really get the nuances. The culture was wrong. We kept them from having the murder happen at Mensa by pointing out that no self-respecting physicist would go to Mensa. But they wouldn't.
No,
Absolutely not. But several years later, they called him back, and you know, they learned. They had clearly been exposed to lots of different kinds of science, and the writers were now much more scientifically savvy. And this was a case where a gymnast was murdered, and her father's a physicist. And it's a beautiful episode. It's called A Spark in the Park. I think it was season 10. And at the end, Brennan goes to visit him, and he's erased all his mathematical equations that my husband wrote. And so he's erased all of them. And he's replaced it with all these different equations that are essentially a mathematical poem to his daughter, her life in movement as described in the equations. And it starts with her at rest and her learning to walk and her being carried on his shoulders and the trampoline and, you know, the parallel bars. And the final series is her back at rest, the final calculation. And I was crying at the end of it, because Richard Schiff, for one thing, played the physicist, but I wasn't the only one. There was an entertainment blogger who said that she hated math and physics, but she says, guys, I cried at a math equation this week. And so when the guy at Manhattan talks about emotionalizing the science, as creepy and tacky as that might sound to you, that's what he's talking about, that you actually marry the good, accurate science with the emotional resonance and you get the best of both worlds.
It's funny that you bring up Bones for that, because Bones has my -- most anger-inducing moment ever.
They have great highs and they have great lows.
Oh, they did. They did. I
think I know which one you're talking about.
So there is one episode in particular, and it's the entire problem I have with this episode takes place in the setup in the first 5 minutes. And they show a corpse that has been found in a hunk of chocolate.
Oh, I remember this.
And there's this really cool thing that happens to corpses if they're surrounded in sugar. It's called melliflucation. I cannot, just Google it.
Well, we can't spell it.
But yeah, basically, it's a kind of embalming that happens when your body is exposed to sugar, because sugar pulls all of the liquids out of your cells and you turn into a really cool sugar mummy. But Bones decided to ignore that and make the body essentially liquefied in order to make a joke about it having a gooey center. And I have been furious with that show ever since then.
You know, the thing is, the sugar corpse would have been far more interesting.
It would have been. That's the thing that
But, you know,
bothers me.
First of all, the writers' rooms, the writers circulate, and different ones are in charge of different episodes, and they make those kind of decisions on a daily basis, several. And sometimes they get notes saying, "Can we have it gooier? Can you make it?" You know, so it's not just one person.
But they had a human corpsicle.
I know. I agree. It would have been better. I'm just saying that's how it works. And that your favorite show is going to get it horribly wrong and horribly right, and mostly somewhere in between.
But I think the thing that bothered me is because that wasn't part of the episode. They could have had the same episode with the actual correct, really cool science to it, but they decided to not do that for the joke.
And it would not have diminished the story at all.
No,
You're right.
Yeah.
It was a bad decision on the part of the writers.
Yeah. Bones is hit or miss, but sometimes what I find is the historical shows that are popping up more and more. I've been really impressed with the chemistry, and I don't know if it's because they're forced to do research. They can't just, it's not modern day where you're like, well, clearly a laser beam's involved, can we have a dolphin? No. And so, there was one show and that I watched when it first got on, but it was, I want to say it was Ripper Street, or Ripper.
Oh, yeah.
And those tests that they mentioned, the different chemical analysis, they got absolutely 100% correct. They work like that. That is how they work. I mean, it was just, I just sat there and I just rewind. I was like, and it looks like magic because it even looked like magic to me, and I know how they work because we still use a lot of these assays. But putting it in the show, of course, in that age, and that it would have looked like magic, but you're like, no, that's how it works. It's amazing. It really, to me, of course, maybe like you were saying, I'm kind of looking for that. But how they built that in and how they used that.
Seamless.
It was just perfection. And it made it, for me, it hooked me in and made me come back and watch more episodes of that series. And so I don't know what it is about certain shows that are set, like, Bletchley Circle, and I would also, Ripper, and then, well, this is more of a modern one, but Whitechapel. Is it because they have to do a certain level of historical research, and so they're like, we better make sure that this assay wasn't actually, come up with in 1910, because this show was set in 1857, and we don't want those people.
Well, I also think, you're talking specifically of chemistry because that's your field, and TV and film people are really visually oriented, and the fact is that those old-time chemistry just look really cool.
They do.
They look great on camera. They are visual box office. So that's another motivation.
Okay.
In addition to doing the historical thing, they find the historical accuracy and it works on screen. So it serves the purposes of the plot.
And Bomb Girls did a similar, in the first, not the first episode, the second or third episode, they have an extended scene where a character gets injured, but the set design of the manufacturing line where these women are creating bombs for the war movement is dead on accurate to pictures of those factories. And I stopped it and went, okay, they did their research. A lot of other things are wrong, but wow, but it's a visual thing.
Yeah, and as far as one of the newer movies, the new Mad Max Fury Road, that one, for me, was pretty fantastic because of how much they did with practical effects. And you look at every single vehicle that they had in that movie, no matter how customized, still could run underneath its own power. And all the physical stunts, the stilt walkers that they had, all practical effects. And that just blew my mind. And sure, there's a little bit of the Hollywood cinema lens put to it because you're not going to be able to get a car jumping like that, when it hits a pothole. But all the realistic damage that they would experience as far as the impacts are fantastic. That was one thing that completely sold me on the movie. So
I feel like we've kind of already started on the second question in the description a little bit, so maybe we can just round that out a little bit more. But it is, what movies have good examples of getting the science right, and how does this make the movie better? So we've talked a little bit about Ripper Street and Mad Max. Are there any other examples of, yep, that is it, and this is why it made this show awesome?
I've been talking about that. So.
If there's any more that we haven't talked about, that's fine.
Well, one that I think was really good was, to some extent, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Because you can look at the space station in that, and the fact that if you actually go and do the calculations for the physics and the centripetal force that is generated based upon the rotation of the space station is basically Earth gravity. And it's just like, I did that back in my high school physics class. I'm like, wow, they actually paid attention to that. Oh, no sound in space. Again, very, very nice to know that, there are still, you're not hearing laser sounds out in space like a lot of other movies are these days. So.
I actually have not a favorite movie, but just, I don't know if you know a book called Hollywood Science by a physicist named Sidney Perkowitz.
Yes.
And it's a wonderful book. Sid's a great guy. And in order to write this book, he basically watched all kinds of old science fiction movies from the 40s and 50s and 60s and beyond. And he watched all of them. I mean, it took him 2 years to write this book. And one of them that he mentioned, I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, Destination Moon, but it was one that everybody prided themselves, NASA engineers were involved, they were going to make the most scientifically accurate movie that they could. And they did. And as Sid put it was boring as hell. And that's why we're talking about marrying these two things. There's a sweet spot that you have to hit, and it's great if it's technically accurate, but if it doesn't have anything compelling to the story, then you might as well just make a documentary. And there's some fine examples of documentaries, From the Earth to the Moon being one of them. Mm-hmm. I personally loved Apollo 13, even though a lot of people kind of nitpick some of the science in there, just because I felt it really captured the truth of that era and those relationships and what drove us. I remember coming out of that thinking, oh my God, we went to the moon in a souped-up Buick. And it showed problem solving, and there was genuine risk, and you don't always get real life stories like that, but I thought it was a fantastic dramatization. And yes, they took liberties. many in fact. And maybe the science, wasn't 100%, accurate based on, your average, physics exam or whatever. But it got enough of it right to really sell the story and really convey the excitement and truth and drama of that moment.
I think there's a lot of chemists in TV and movies, and usually we're all staring intently at colored liquids with no safety gear on at all. But I think for me, especially as a forensic chemist, the shows I would just burn CSI to the ground. But the shows that are actually, I think, really great, and the top one would be The Wire.
Oh yeah.
Which is not a show actually about forensic science, but that's the real deal, is that forensic scientists are, support staff. And they don't have a center stage role because they're not the ones actually investigating crime. And so the way that was done, especially if you Google The Wire and you Google, is anyone gonna have a problem if I say the F word? There is this fantastic scene I always show to my students. It's from The Wire, and they have a complete dialogue using nothing but the word fuck.
Oh yeah.
They are recreating a crime scene.
It's my favorite scene.
And it is the most brilliant. That is what actually occurs. That is perfection. And the other thing I would say is also the original Law and Order that was on for 20 years is how you see forensic scientists interweaving with that, the medical examiner and the scene people, and how they're in the background, but every once in a while they pop up. That and how that is actually used as a resource. It's just another tool that might answer a question, or it might not. It might bring up more questions than it answers. Those two.
Ray, how do you feel about Homicide?
Love it.
Yeah, because that was David Simon's. Because that was David Simon's precursor.
Love it.
That was
Love
the
it all
precursor
day
to The
long.
Wire. Some of the
Yes.
best things he had been dramatizing.
Love it. SVU.
There's a
burn
guy
to the
here with
ground.
something to say.
Yeah.
We're filming this, right? We can get the sound clip of how do you feel about Homicide? Love it.
Love it. Those would be the shows, because I think they really show what science is used for in what we call, and I'm an applied scientist, so that's my bias, is that we put it to work. And that's what it looks like, is what does working science look like? Is that you get, this report and you're like, shit. Or you're like, yes. Or a lot of times somewhere in between, because the answer is, below limit of detection, or there's no quote smoking gun. And so at best what you're gonna get is just you're gonna get these two guys in a room looking at some photos going, and that is, I think that pretty much sums up science.
And I think, honestly, that's part of the beauty of the scientific method. You should go in not having any sort of preconceptions on what you expect the result to be. And, there are instances where, I've run a test and go like, I think it's going to be this, and then it comes from, like, left field, and I'm like, I did not expect that at all.
And I would think The Walking Dead. I show, actually, this next year I plan to kick off my general chemistry class by showing a clip from The Walking Dead, season 1, episode 3, called Guts. And it is by far the single best 2 or 3 minutes that sums up the entire scientific process. Shit, we've got to get away from these goddamn zombies. How do we do that? And Andrea, in the moment of brilliance, is like, duh, this is how we do it. And like problem solving. What's the problem? Come up with a hypothesis, then go do it, try an experiment, get some data, refine.
So the theoretical physicist died right away.
Yeah, toast. All right. We don't have time for you and your calculations.
Oh yeah, yeah, we do.
But a zombie, that's the thing, is a zombie show in that moment on the rooftop in Atlanta, when they're surrounded on all sides by ridiculousness, to me is the single best example of the scientific method in a condensed form of how it would happen. If your life depended on it, could you summarize all of science now? And so I think that's one of those brilliant moments. And I don't know what their thought process was on that episode. They know that they unwittingly created this moment of perfection of summing up what science is, but they stumbled on it. in that show. And they did it a couple different times that they've done that, especially like the first season I think was really strong in that. And so, yeah, my students are subjected to all kinds of insanity.
I'm totally taking your class. You should put it online.
Well, there was a couple other things that I think we have mentioned wanting to talk about. Jennifer, you did specifically had some stuff?
I think we covered a lot of it, actually.
Okay.
Look at that.
Uh-oh.
Well, so are there any other things that the panelists wanted to bring up that hasn't come up yet? And then after that, we'll open it up to questions.
I want to hear more from Jen about the process of, the experts and then, because some of the movies I remember we had the conversation in the car about, wait, they had a science advice or something?
Oh yeah, that was for Angels and Demons. It was on the Quizatron thing.
Yes, I had no idea.
Yeah, and actually Sean was one of them that met with the writers and with Ron Howard and whoever that other guy was that he worked with. A really big deal, and I'm sorry I'm blanking on his name.
Laser?
Pardon?
Laser?
Brian Grazer, yes.
Yes.
Thank you. But they met with a lot of different scientists, and then the writer's strike happened, and there was like a year and a half before they went back to the script, and a lot happened, and they didn't go back to the physicists. But one of the things that they kept from that early thing was the explosion of the antimatter bomb. Now, there's a lot wrong with Angels and Demons, but in fact, there is such a thing as antimatter. There's not that much of it. You do need to keep it in a special trap. It doesn't look like a little canister, but okay. But when they asked him, well, what would an explosion of antimatter look like? All the physicists went, you know what? Give us a day. And because actually we don't know. And so they actually got together and spent like 2 hours doing the equations and figuring out, and they actually said, well, it would like explode and then it would suddenly like collapse back in for a moment before you get that final shock wave. And there's complicated physics reasons for why that is, that if you Google it, you can find online. But that is, in fact, what you see in the film. And that's what I call these small victories, right? There's a lot to be frustrated with, and no one's claiming that Angels and Demons is like the best possible science-based movie ever made. But you savor those moments. And that was one that got through. This whole process spanning like 5 years with multiple notes, 2 different directors, 5 different writers, and somehow that one little part got through. And yay.
Do they come, do the entertainment people come to the exchange then? Like, can you
it varies. There actually there wasn't before the exchange any set process. They would just, an assistant would randomly start calling universities trying to find someone who was a specialist, and you can see how often that worked out well. So you try and find someone with the correct expertise who also has the right attitude towards narrative and story. When they call them in is key. If they're early enough, they can actually really shape the raw material. But if that's it and they don't come back later on, then they can't reshape it after it's gone through several editorial processes. And I'm a writer, and I can tell you that every now and then you get an overzealous editor that rewrites everything and you have to come in and fix it. If that doesn't happen, then you're going to get problems. It depends on the person. There have been people who really just want, this is my plot, give me something cool that I can just throw in here and I don't need to hear anything else. And there are people who really, really want to understand the science and be true to it as much as they can within the constraints and pressures that they face as they try and bring it from idea to screen. So there's a lot of stuff all the way in between. Ideally, I think that you would want something like what Kip Thorne and Steven Spielberg initially conceived, was that they would do this movie together. It was just bad luck that Spielberg and Paramount fell out, and it was too late to get the rights back from Paramount. I think we have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Just responding to that, how it is a small victory, but probably a reason a lot of things, other scientific things were wrong in that movie is because that one small victory, you think about it, probably didn't improve the movie. That's kind of what this question is about. What?
Really? I thought it was a really cool explosion.
Cool. How it works.
It improved it for me.
Cool if you know how it works.
And it looked great.
But it doesn't really tie into the story in any way. If that explosion was all wrong, it wouldn't have made a difference. And that's what we're trying to figure out, is how does science make the movie better? And
Well,
most movie makers want to put good science in.
Right, and that's why I don't hold Angels and Demons up as an example of that part of the question. It's not the perfect movie. Pardon?
Small difference.
Yes. you want the thing to be like what Ray is talking about with her favorite shows, or that moment, that final scene in Bones. You would like the shows to be like that all the time. It's really hard. You know, that is the perfection that we strive to and never quite achieve, right? Except on rare occasions. Anyone who's, I used to do martial arts, and every now and then the throw would just work perfectly. But I had to like screw up a lot before to get to that point. And most of the stuff were not abject failures or perfection. They were somewhere in between. And I think you're going to get the same thing with a lot of film.
I think you'll find, I think even some of the films that are just ridiculous, and anyone who knows me knows I love, there's nothing I love more than a made-for-TV Sci-Fi Channel movie. And those are awful.
You're a huge fan of those.
I am a huge fan of those, and they are always just ridiculous. Sharknado, you know, lava spewing tarantulas coming from the earth, which Bug tells me is totally not gonna happen. But then even in, I think it was Mecha Shark versus Mega Shark, a classic if you haven't seen it. Again, you could even have a nugget in there of you're like, well, crap, that's actually what you have to do. Just, the rest of it, you're right, it's Mecha Shark versus Mega Shark, and there are multiple things on many, many levels that are wrong with it, but, you know, I think that maybe, you know, how to make it good, science to make a movie better, at some point we have to be a little bit, you know, can you
I don't want to give up
enough?
my camp.
I don't want to give up my
I want
camp,
Doctor
but
Who to be silly.
Can you make it, you know, enough of the nuggets, just to sprinkle enough of the gems to kind of, people will follow along. And I think that's what ties me in. And I am, like, you know, it's just enough of the, just sprinkle enough of the little gems and the nuggets that I just want to follow it along, even if that requires me to believe in a Time Lord, you know, who regenerates and never actually regenerates into anyone who looks remarkably different. And I mean like a woman or a minority. Because there aren't any of those haven't been invented yet.
I have a campaign to get Idris Elba to be the next Doctor. And I'm sure there are many that share my enthusiasm for that.
I always thought Richard Ayoade would have been good.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Any other questions? Yeah.
That's a sort of a comment, sort of flash question. I don't know if any of you ever watched Burn Notice.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
So I love the first season and then less as it keeps going. And,
As many of us do.
and I think that one was maybe an example of getting science right, and I'm not a super, you know, I'm not an advanced scientist, so I don't know that it's all right. But
But it was right enough.
yeah, and that first season feel and really enhancing the show as a whole, because it was very much, you know, yes, I'm you know, a former spy. I don't do things that you do in the movies. Here's what actually works. And that was so much his character and so much what that show was about, and doing things that at least felt very much like you could do that really did enhance the entire show and fit the whole field.
Well, I think that goes back to kind of the hook that they need to do, especially in first seasons of TV shows.
Yeah.
So you have something that seems plausible and is interesting, and now we get into the realm of, you know, good writing can trump bad science, or good writing can trump bad spy work.
Yeah. I do feel like with that one too, though, as that got less true, the whole show.
I'm pretty sure that a professional spy would be really bugged by Burn Notice.
Oh,
Yeah.
Lawyers hated Ally McBeal. You know?
Yes.
Teachers
Yes.
hated Boston Public.
Yeah, spies also, CIA hates 24. I mean, it's, State Department doesn't, no, actually State Department likes Homeland.
I have a question. So, good science, like, what's your favorite scientist, or your favorite depiction of an actual scientist? Because there are a lot of scientist characters.
Yeah.
So you want our favorite scientist character as opposed to actual favorite scientist.
I know.
There has never been an accurate anthropologist portrayed ever. Hint, we don't fight Nazis.
What?
Lies. I know you're surprised. I can neither confirm nor deny that.
I'm gonna put another plug in, give Eureka some love. You know, it's not even a single scientist. I loved them all.
The community
Yeah.
of science.
The community of scientists, it really captured the camaraderie, the love, the quarrels, the hate, the annoying personalities who were nonetheless brilliant scientists and they could still figure out how to work with each other.
And they were all quirky in their own
And they were
special
all
way.
quirky in their own special way. I would kill to live in Eureka. I would be the dumbest person there, but I would love it.
You'd be the sheriff.
I'd be the sheriff.
Who actually saved the day, like,
But that's great because
Yes.
he didn't do it alone. And what it showed was that he could work with the scientists and they each brought something special to solve the problem. And that he wasn't an other, he was in fact, as a sheriff and a detective or a marshal, a little budding gut scientist.
Well, and he also brought a different perspective to the entire scenario. Because, like, you know, all the scientists would be running around going, okay, how do I use my field to figure this out? And you have the sheriff who's like, well, why don't we do this?
He was very good at defining the problem,
Yes.
Yeah,
And,
which is an important step.
which is an important step. And yeah.
I think the team dynamic is really, you know, that teamwork as far as the mythology of scientists being kind of lone wolves that are socially awkward and, you know, white and male, that even that is still kind of a persistent, but
Yeah, and Eureka, you had socially awkward, but you also had
very
hot.
savvy, yes.
And savvy.
And you had people, I mean, you know, like Allison, as far as, you know, being, you know, this authoritative person who's in charge of this whatever, I can never really figure out what it
Global
is.
dynamic. No one knows.
But, you know, having to actually pull the team together in very different areas, and it highlighted that personnel issues are going to trump expertise. So basically, you people get your shit together. I mean, a lot of the
And
problems. get your
funding
shit
was
together.
actually funding was a key plot point on several
Yes.
several seasons, and that actually is something that matters to scientists. You have to make a deal with the devil, in this case, the Department of Defense, and that means that you don't always get. You have to make some hard choices, and it compromises you. And is the end result worth it? And those are important questions, and they asked them and never answered them completely, and that's what a good show does.
I love Eureka too, but I would put in a plug for a character. My favorite scientist actually technically isn't a scientist, but I'm going to call her one. Miss Marple.
Oh,
And I would hold her up as an example to my students of, you know, you have someone who you're going to hear things over the course of the years of your education, and you are going to need to pull these bits of information and be able to see and build this bigger picture. And so that is what she's always comes back, well, back in the village of St. Mary's Mead, we had this one, you're like, how is she gonna wrap this up? I don't know how she's gonna wrap up Timmy with the cake stealing, but okay. And being able to see all these little pieces of the people around her and to be that keen and that observant and to retain that kind of information and build these connections, that is, I think, she had this superior mind of kind of reasoning that I would say, you know, Miss Marple would be my go-to.
Well, I thought of a positive example as opposed to a negative one. So I've been rewatching Star Trek Voyager recently, and I think one of my favorite scientist characters ever is Captain Janeway, because, okay, all the other captains in Star Trek, they get there by being good captains. Like any woman, Janeway had to be a brilliant scientist and then become a good captain. But she actually uses her scientific knowledge in being a captain. Like, she thinks through, let's try this. Will that work? Let me talk about it with my other female scientist, B'Elanna Torres, and we'll discuss this. And then we'll figure out leadership from it. And I love that she actually takes her scientific perspective and brings it into the rest of her life. Even though she's not.
She passes the Bechdel test, too.
Yeah, she
They
passes
don't
the
talk
Bechdel
about
test.
clothes and boys.
Well, they passed the Bechdel test in the first 10 minutes of the first episode, and the first entire 7 minutes of the episode are 3 people of color talking to no white people. Just
double Bechdel.
Just to know.
So you want to make a quick point? Torres was an engineer, so
Oh,
you
so
got applied science.
I'm gonna say this because it's gonna be controversial. Engineers or scientists?
I agree. I was just about to say that.
Don't
And
knock
not
it
with
off,
this
my friend.
stupid delineation between, because I don't think that's really science.
No, engineering is science, and we can fight about it in the hallway afterwards. You've had your hand
And
up
I'm
for-
backing her.
You've had.
All the characters switch bodies.
Oh.
That could totally happen.
Worked out this original mathematical formula to devise exactly how many switches were needed to get everyone back to their original bodies. So I'm wondering if the panelists can think of any other examples where a show didn't just do their research, but actually inspired some new investigation into a new area of science, or inspired someone to get, whether this thing could actually happen in the show.
Well, I mean, obviously there's an entire book on math in The Simpsons. Simpsons have amazing mathematical stuff in there, in part because some of the writers are mathematicians, have degrees in math and physics. I would throw that out there since we're talking cartoons.
Even though I was kind of railing on it earlier, Interstellar is one of the best representations of a black hole that we've seen today. I mean, scientists actually provided the equations to the special effects department.
Kip Thorne did that.
Yeah, and yeah, it looks pretty. It really sells you on, we're near a black hole. And considering usually, previously at least how I learned it, you look at the event horizon of a black hole and they always kind of describe it as a funnel. And as soon as you get to the event horizon, which is somewhere on that funnel, you're basically screwed and you're going to go into spaghettification. So now seeing the an actual 3D representation.
It's a true sphere.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually that was the point I made at the very beginning of the session. Kip actually will be publishing papers on that. He worked extremely closely with the visual effects guys, and they had to completely rework all their rendering software because his equations were so advanced. So first of all, Hollywood has now gotten some incredibly new, improved rendering software thanks to this, and Kip actually they actually made some scientific discovery about the behavior of a black hole under these conditions. They plugged in the variables and they came out with this beautiful visualization, and the filmmakers went, "It looks beautiful," and Kip went, "It is true." And again, that's a wonderful, wonderful moment. I also thought that it was, since we're talking about Interstellar, the other thing that I actually liked about the movie was that they used time dilation as a very effective plot device to, bring some conflict and some emotional resonance there. Now, obviously, if you do the calculations, they're not right, and Kip told them that, and they said, well, but we're doing it, because otherwise it's just too complicated and it actually bogs down the story. But as a result, I think now people see the movie and now have some sense that if you get near a black hole, time does something funky, and that's a win in my book.
But that's a big concept, really, for non-physicists to get. So.
Yeah, when my husband, right after the movie came out, was playing poker in Vegas, and they found out he was a physicist at his table, and suddenly everybody was far more interested in asking him about black holes than about playing poker, because they'd seen Interstellar. So that's another factor to keep in mind. I mean, everybody in this room, we're all hardcore geeks, and we know our science, and we get really bugged by it, but as an outreach tool, it's pretty powerful stuff.
No, it can't be beat. I mean, that's, for as many chemists that complain about why is the only one on TV, it gave us such an in with, whether you're in academia or you're at conferences like this, that you can talk about chemistry in a way that, isn't going to involve, some kind of, people really were passionate about that show, and you could talk about things. Same thing with, as much as, you rail on Bones or Friends, and we've had many conversations about that. You can actually get people to talk about things. Maybe because some of it you're like, yep, that was good. Nope, this is really, really bad. But as an outreach tool, I think I can't think of anything that compares with the representations on film.
I call them teaching moments.
Absolutely.
I've had more talks about what dinosaurs actually were like in the past 3 weeks with my developer coworkers than ever. Every time a movie comes out, they're like, oh, you with the science stuff. What's a theropod? Okay, well, not that movie, but I'll show you what it really is. And it's cool.
In the back.
Yes, hi. I was watching the film Interstellar, and I was especially awed by how that they could travel backwards into time. It seemed to me the question they posed but never answered is, if you could travel backwards into time, all the people who have died would be in existence. So would that kind of answer the question as to whether there's life after death?
Wow, that's
Do we have a philosopher?
that is beyond physics.
Yeah, that's a deep one. I don't have an answer for that one.
Yeah, that is a whole other panel to
No, I would
itself.
actually argue no because just how time travel works. This is married to a physicist who actually I call the Time Lord because he feels very strongly. Get him started on time travel in movies. Oh my God. Looper just drove him crazy. So he goes, but Bill and Ted he loved, and he also loved Lost because Lost had this notion of whatever happened, and that to him is a really key element. It's not Back to the Future. So when you say they go back in time and that's a way of being life after death, no, it's the same people. You're going back in time, you know. So it's not like they've moved on to a different thing. It's not like they're living on in some new form. It's the exact same place and person and time they were at that moment being recreated. Whatever happened. So it's think of it more as a loop rather than life after death. I kind of think of as being what happens next. This is not that. This is more like being caught in a little closed time-like curve of solipsistic hell.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but
Think Groundhog Day rather than life after life.
correct me if I'm wrong, but if you just go the other direction and you believe what Frank Kepler believes, that you go the other direction and you have the omega point where.
Yeah.
It's a little bit philosophical.
My husband
in
has
opinion.
thoughts on Frank Tipler's ideas.
Me too. Yeah, me too. Not very convincing anyway.
Yeah.
You guys talk a lot about how good science can do great things. Do you think that really bad science in these movies causes active damage?
Yes. And I have a perfect example of that.
No, really, how do you feel?
But it's a good and bad example in that there's something called, quote, the CSI effect. And it kind of gets to your statement that there's actually been a lot of scholarship written in Journal of Forensic Science and many, many law journals, legal scholars, is that show alone has had a marked effect on what people expect to be possible, when they serve on juries. And it's a chilling effect to the point of what they expect is actually, Grissom to come wandering in and be like, it was Mr. Green in the library with this candlestick, and I know because I use a laser. And that is a mark. I mean, you have this research of what the kinds of jury questions that people come back with, and the kind of information they're demanding. And there's you've kept this data for the existence of the criminal justice system. And from the advent of the show, I mean, this is a real thing. They've tested it, they've seen. And now, of course, they've got researchers that are doing data as the CSI shows have been canceled and are going off the air in some way. I mean, they have CSI Cyber. I don't even know if that's still on. Hey, let's not go there. But how does that then, will you see this kind of almost, or has it made such a lasting effect, the CSI effect? And this is a real problem. I mean, there are whole conferences, legal and forensic conferences, that you have to deal with. You're going to get a question from an attorney, or and I did one time make a smart ass answer. Well, yes, let me go grab my CSI button. But that is a real issue that you've had. Pop culture tell people something, they absolutely think it's the way it is, and then it has a lasting effect on the criminal justice system and the civil justice system on what people expect. So the power of bad science and the reach of pop culture is absolutely a measurable thing for that particular genre. Now, I don't think anyone's going to be wandering around in the Home Depot and asking, how do I build a black hole in my backyard? But for something like this was definitely a measurable kind of research. People have the data on this effect.
Was this previously prefigured in the way that even cops, after being trained, the gun stuff don't work like they work on television and movies, still are convinced that they do, even when they get in situations where this happens?
Well, that's the funny thing, is the CSI effect is so pervasive that people who you think should know better, law enforcement and attorneys, are thinking like, well, why don't you have DNA? Because your client broke into a car and we're not going to spend $2,000 to run that test. I don't know what you're talking about. So that kind of people that quote you think know better, sometimes the power of these images and the shows running for so long, they absolutely buy into it, which is great if it's done well. And so that, and I can't even think of a non-forensic equivalent that had that kind of, maybe a medical show.
I would
that
say,
had
I
some
would say a medical
doctors.
show. Nothing in physics, we're just not that relevant.
You know, thinking that I've got
I
everyone.
mean, we're
has
very
cancer.
relevant, but we're not that noticeable.
Yeah.
Not that fun to watch, I guess.
Going back kind of to when you actually brought up Walking Dead. One of the things with shows that have some kind of apocalypse, at the end of it, there's very few humans left. What about like all the nuclear power plants that would at some point destroy the rest of the world? Maybe, or do they just kind of take care of themselves? How long time would you have before there was nothing left?
You're going to be eaten by a zombie by then? So
No, I was going to say
that.
there's actually a very good book called The World Without Us, and unfortunately the author's name currently escapes me, but it's a thought experiment and with some actual scientific backing to explore, you know, what's going to happen to the buildings, what's going to happen to the gas stations as the liners and the tanks start to degrade and you're starting to see gasoline and diesel fuel leak into the surrounding area.
Alan Wiseman.
Thank you.
Google knows all.
But yeah, I would highly recommend reading that book because that takes kind of the science fiction out of it and actually lays it out.
Did they not make a documentary series based on it?
They did, but it wasn't this.
Wasn't
based
good?
on it. It was-
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
It was Discovery Eyes, wasn't it?
Questions?
Okay, so it's well established the possibility of bad science doing ill for society. Are there any cases where bad science in popular culture can do good?
Well, again, the teaching moments, yes. I actually think that, sometimes it's so bad that, and it's so pervasive that you can actually, use that as an example. It's like, and it's funny, so you can actually do it with humor. So that's the most obvious one. The more pernicious things, you were talking to, I really shouldn't say that physics doesn't matter, because obviously it does, but there are wrong ideas that people have about quantum mechanics in particular that are pervasive and are extremely difficult. There are some, you're the size, my people, that it's the equivalent of magic, and we can blame whoever that physicist was that said quantum mechanics was the closest thing physics has to magic, and he was speaking, metaphorically, shall we say, and kind of flowery, but people seem to think that's literally, that all you really have to do is go up to someone and go, quantum, and then they can do anything.
Everything super is labeled quantum. I realize that all the products in the stores now, it's not just like supersized or like super strength. No, it's quantum.
And
It's quantum-sized, who wants it?
It's quantum sized, so it's like discrete sized.
But super powerful.
And on a more positive note, imagination, even when it's bad science, often drives technological innovation.
That's true.
In the 60s, these were bullshit. Okay, no children. These were bullshit.
Ray said fuck. I mean, come on.
Well, okay.
Well, keep in mind.
But now this generation of innovators grew up thinking, oh yeah, well I should totally have a touch screen thing I carry around in my hand and access the sum of human knowledge, and I'm going to carry 2 of them in my purse.
Yeah, actually, I was going to say the same thing, that Martin Cooper, the guy who invented the cell phone, was a huge Star Trek fan, and he wanted a flip phone.
And that's why flip phones are much more popular in the U.S. than they were in the U.K. is because of that.
Right, but of course, I remember a comedian was talking about this, and he said, and of course now we look at it and think, why is Kirk still using like a flip phone? Where's the iPhone?
Keep in mind, Captain Picard piloted the original tablet in 1988.
Oh,
That's true.
So.
And now 3D printers. I remember being
We made
a
it
kid,
so.
And
3D food printers. no
the
less.
first time I saw a 3D printer in grad school, I was like, holy shit, I'm living in Star Trek. This is the best I've ever seen. And then trying to remain calm on the outside because you're super cool. But as soon as the first time I saw an industrial sized 3D printer, and it was just, we are living in the future. Like,
Well, here's a fun fact. We used to use those in the automotive industry to actually prototype vehicle parts. And then you could actually use a 3D printer nowadays and create fully functional parts for those vehicles. So a lot of prototype vehicles these days, additive manufacturing is the way to go.
Awesome. Well, and unfortunately, looking at the time, we are out of it. So, any final thoughts as we leave?
thank you guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.